heated debate about how to force corporations to become more socially responsible. And one of the very popular proposals has been to act through their debt providers. But before we start thinking about how to regulate corporations through their debt providers, we say that it would be helpful to ask, do brown companies have different debt? Specifically, do they face different costs of debt, and do they have different structure? Let me give you a preview of our results. First, to the first question about the cost of debt, we find that yes, brown firms seem to have different costs of debt. First, it is generally more expensive to obtain both public debt and loans for brown companies. But borrowing from banks compared to the public market is relatively cheaper for brown than for big companies. So our second question, do perhaps as a result, brown companies choose the debt structure to find that banks provide more credit to the brown companies and public bondholders provide less credit to the brown companies, and as a result, brown companies shift their debt structure towards having more loan financing. We are motivating our study by the theory of asymmetric economy. Imagine we have 4 pretty similar companies, considered factories, and they're financed by banks and by the public market, by bondholders. Initially, they have different debt structures. Some of them are completely financed by loans, some of them completely by the public debt, and some of them by obligation. I'm going to make the arrows on the bank bigger to denote that typically banks have closer relationships with their borrowers and understand more about their borrowers. Because banks tend to invest more in screening and monitoring, they have close relationship with their borrowers compared to the public. Imagine all of our companies suddenly realize that they are more brown than they were before. Imagine if they're facing a world. And well, some of these companies, even though they are brown, are not going to have any adverse financial consequences from being brown. So even though they are risky from a climate standpoint, it is not going to affect their financial conditions. But other companies, perhaps because of regulatory penalties or because of customer penalties, are going to suffer adverse financial. And from the public debt holders' perspective, because these debt holders are more distant from their borrowers, they may not be able to distinguish which of these companies are which of them will and which of them will not have adverse consequences from being for their cash. And well, public debt holders, because they're on average expect an adverse effect from the companies being brown, they would choose to divest from all their bonds. Now, from the bank's perspective, because banks are closer with their borrowers and oftentimes understand their business more and have more interaction with the company management, they might be able to distinguish between the brown borrowers who will and will not face adverse financial consequences from being brown. So bank loan providers would extend more credit to companies who will not face adverse financial consequences from being brown, and we might use funding to also become financially risky. And well, as a result, we would see that brown companies would tend to have greater fraction of bank loan funding compared to the public. Based on this theory, we come up with 2 hypotheses of the past. First, we hypothesize that for brown companies, borrowing from banks is going to be cheaper than borrowing from the public market. And the second hypothesis is that perhaps as a result, brown companies would shift their debt structure toward having more loan pressure. As a saying, we are going to use the database. So the database is the database of public announcements then a company is essentially drowning, or that the company has violated one of the United Nations global compacts. Importantly, these are announcements not coming from the company itself, so this is coming from NGOs or from environmental activists or social media. These are two examples of the events that could be in our database. So the first announcement is a Wall Street Journal article about a state suing a company for violating Clean Air Act. And the second is the news piece saying that a large institutional investor is divesting from the Peruvian company because the company is found to violate human rights. We're using this setting in two ways. First, an ESG rating in our study is going to be based on the cumulative announcements about the company. So imagine you are violating one of these UNGC principles about every 6 months, then you're going to have a big bad ESG rating, you will be considered very brown. But if you have violated something once and then did pretty well for, say, the next 5 years, you're going to be charged pretty highly. The second way we're using the setting is we take the very first announcement that a company has violated one of the UNGC principles as a shock to revelation by debt providers that the company is brown, or at least more brown than the debt providers. We also take loan data from the standard portfolio. We use bond data from FISD and Virgin, and we take company information from this point. Okay, so to our first question, do brown and green companies have different cost of debt? And specifically, is loan funding cheaper than bond funding for brown companies? This question is inherently difficult to answer because, as we discussed in perhaps many sessions, bonds and loans are very different types of debt. They have very different recovery rates, very different recovery upon default, very different probabilities of default, and different seniority. So it's inherently difficult to compare the cost of these protections. We're trying to do that by using a methodology developed by Michael Schwartz. And this methodology proceeds in two steps. First, we pair loans and bonds issued by the same company on the same day. So they assume that by doing that, we're fixing probabilities and times. And then, in the second step, to account for differences in seniority and recovery rates, we're using a structural model of credit. So let me talk more about it. The intuition of the model is as follows. So the payoff to the senior debt is analogous to the payoff to a portfolio consisting of a risky bond and a short put option that is struck at the face value of the senior debt. So you can think of this one asset. The second, the payoff to junior debt is analogous to a payoff consisting of a portfolio of a long call option that is struck at the face value of the senior debt, and a short call option struck at the face value of the senior plus junior debt. So you can just think of the payoff to the senior and the junior debt as payoff to two different portfolios. If you think that way, we can use Merton's model to price these two portfolios. And well, for one of them, specifically for junior debt, we already have the market price, right? Bonds are traded on the market. And the only parameter that would be missing from the Merton's model would be the asset volatility parameter. So what we do is, first, we use junior debt, because we have, for the Merton's model, for the junior debt, we have everything except for the asset volatility parameter. So we solve the Merton's model and compute the asset volatility parameter, and then we plug that parameter into the Merton's model for the senior debt to find the price of the loan as if it was traded on the financial market. And then the difference between the actual spread on the loan and the spread suggested by the Northeast model would be the premium for the discount for borrowing from the bank compared to borrowing from the market. And what we find is first, consistent with Macroeconomic's paper, generally borrowing from the banks is more expensive than from the market. But for brown companies, this difference is actually much less than for the green companies. So for brown company, borrowing from banks is about 0.9 percentage points more expensive than borrowing from the market. Whereas for green companies, this number is 2.2. So we do find that borrowing from banks is relatively cheaper for brown companies than for the green. Now, to our second question, do brown companies as a result have different debt structure? We are asking three specific questions. After the company becomes brown or more brown, does the company obtain more higher loan amounts from their banks? Does the company borrow more from the public market? And does the overall debt structure shift towards having more loan financing? First, to the question of the bank loans, it seems like after a brown event happens to the company for the first time, the amount of loans issued to the company is increased. And kind of to corroborate our theory, the likelihood of taking a loan from the same lender is also increased. So because presumably lenders can identify companies that are financially healthy, even though they are brown, the lenders are going to provide even more capital. Now, for the bond amount, we find the opposite. After the company is revealed to be brown or more brown, the company is reducing the bond debt amount, and it continues to decrease as more things pass after the company was revealed to be brown. Finally, to answer a bit more tightly the question of the debt structure, we're not going to compare generally brown to green companies because this could be inherently different types of companies. So what we do is we propensity score match companies that do and do not experience an adverse ESG event, and then compare the debt structures of these companies. Or specifically, the newly issued debt for this type of companies. Well, and what we find is first that the companies that are brown tend to obtain more credit in general, but the amount of credit obtained from loans is statistically much higher than the amount obtained from loans. So brown companies do indeed shift their debt structure towards having more loan payments. Okay, I think I'm wrapping up a little bit early. So let me quickly conclude. In this paper, we hypothesize and show that brown companies have different costs of debt compared to green companies. So specifically, borrowing from banks is relatively cheaper for brown companies. And perhaps as a result, brown companies prefer to shift their debt structure towards having more loans and less bond payments. Thank you for your attention, and thank you for answering.
Thank you. I was wondering, could you apply this information asymmetry framework also to green companies? So namely that as a public investor, I see that everything green is good, and as a bank, I can see, which one are more healthy than other, and try also to have the symmetric finding that you have for brown companies, because the question would be the same, no?
That's a good point. I agree with you that you expect banks to better be able to understand the business of green borrowers as well. I think why brown companies is a a bit different setting is, so presumably public bondholders either perceive brown companies as generally more risky, so they would divest from that, and then they would free up space that banks would do. Whereas for green companies, if public bondholders are willing to provide enough capital, there might not be space for the banks to do it. So I'm not sure if you see like this difference, but for brown companies, there's clearly this difference.
But you would see for green companies that have a weaker financial health, perhaps the bank divesting from them and not the public fund. So the theory is the same, but you have the opposite outcome.
Yes, that's a good suggestion. I think we should just the opposite.
May not have been extensive enough. Could you tell me a little bit more about brown and green companies here? Is it US? Is it private, public? How large are these companies? Car manufacturers, companies, oil companies? I don't know. I'm just trying to get a better sense of what is behind these labels. And then the second question is related. I mean, this theory with information and symmetry, I think that's quite plausible. And I was wondering if you slice your data set into private and public companies, that may, you could say that public companies are publicly traded, maybe that information asymmetry may not be as strong, and maybe you don't find the effect there. Just wondering. But I really like the presentation.
So first about our sample. So this is US companies from the Computer database. So sample is in terms of financial characteristics and industry is pretty much representative of the US public companies. So this is only the public companies that we have. About which companies are green and brown. As when I was discussing this, I was saying that we're doing it in two ways. So one way is a brown company is a company that has been announced to violate one of the emergency principles multiple times over a short period of time. So basically, the company doesn't have has oil spills, it's one company or has human rights violations for consumers and for their employees. So this is one way we define brown versus green. And in other tests, when we do an advanced study, we define a brown company as a company that has a first announcement that it has violated a emergency principle. So say if your patient is perfectly clear, and then there is a news article that says that, oh, an investigation found that you violate your employees' human rights. So we will compare you to your peer who has not had such an announcement. So it would be brown if you peer who hadn't had such an announcement. So this is your first question. To the second question, this is something that we are actually thinking about as a way to strengthen our theory. So we have just in the paper, there are not purely slides that to show that this effect is stronger for relationship borrowers. So if a bank has been with the borrower for a long period of time, so presumably they have extracted more information, and the information symmetry between these loan providers and the overall financial market is greater. The other thing we were thinking of is looking at generally larger companies, so companies with greater analyst following, such that so the companies with greater analyst following would have less their investors on the market would have less information symmetry compared to loan providers, because there is a lot of information analysis. But that's
the definition of green brown. So my understanding in the literature aligns which are means distributed. So how much is this so much about green versus brown versus you got caught being green and brown? And so I mean, and I understand these theories have lots of problems, different data, different results, etc.
But it does get to also the notion of trying to the future financial, it might not be so much from the firm, but rather whether they're getting fines, they have a robust balance sheet. It's issue 24, so it's really just about risk in general, from events that usually won't around. Just to kind of bring it into my case of other studies.
Yes, yes. So I totally agree that any round issue related presumably can be just overall riskier company, and we've got a lot of comments related to how is it different from overall like financial risk and financial shocks. And our answer for now would be that when a debt provider is starting a contract and choosing interest rate, they presumably take into account the overall financial risk, including potential adverse effects that can affect the company financial. And these risks are pretty much well studied and understood, so they are incorporated in the pricing already. Whereas the risks related to the ESG environment are less studied and cannot be accounted for in non-environmental operators. So that's what makes them perhaps a unique setting.
Okay, well, I'm just curious if you try to find, really particular buses.
Yeah.
Take another ESG rating. For example.
Yes, we should absolutely. And so far without hope within the risk, but with both having like an accumulation of events, which is the first event. But yes, definitely.
Would the outcomes of the study be consistent for a down country that's operating in an emerging economy or an underdeveloped economy, say Asian economy or any African economy? I think why I'm asking this question because the TCFD frameworks, that is the financial disclosure requirements that come from the regulatory angle, is more stringent in say US markets or European markets as compared to other markets. So would the outcome of the study change with regards to the TCFD because it's not consistent across the world, the TCFD framework?
Yes, absolutely. So actually, I think that I would expect the result to be even stronger in an emerging economy. And the first reason would be that one of the reasons are related to the information symmetry theory that we use. So first, because in emerging economies, presumably financial markets are a bit less developed, and like some countries don't have like the regulatory or other regulations that kind of try to level the playing among traders. So generally, like information symmetry is stronger given how developed the financial markets are. And second, you are right, because so relatively the public companies and a lot of companies, for example, actually do provide sometimes sustainability report and some of them do use the framework. In an emerging economy, you would expect companies to provide less information, less public information about how they are addressing their client risks, etc. So we would expect public investors who use public information to be even more confused about how to look at an adverse ESG event for the company's financial consequences. So again, the information asymmetry would be even stronger.
But what about if that company's financials are very robust and sound? The information asymmetry is only with regards to the ESG aspects. But if it's financially quite robust and sound, will the cost of debt for that company be still change? Just a question. I'm just asking that as an investor.
If an investor can identify that, oh, this company is indeed financially robust and even an adverse ESG event will not have any effect, then yes, you wouldn't see a public holder divestment. But we're saying that on average, they may not be always to distinguish which companies are financially robust in the crime event with the real understood and which are not. So, but yes, if for a specific company investors perfectly understand, even public investors, then it will be.
Thanks a lot. I got a guess on the comparison between the cost of loan versus bond money. With a slide on that where you show what's what you do. That's actually with the market model. I'm wondering, given that the data restrictions is why you don't think you like the loan information directly, so you try to back it out. And I was thinking whether it's not trying to check this both with the here, lack data, but the probably available companies with some other statistics that you said were the US data, others from the debts side, like say aggregate statistics on loans to SMEs, larger corporates, and so on. And we have time series with a lot of statistics on the data. And we put benchmarking also what is happening where we own business, not taking into account for a start all the ESG component, but in general, when you all stuff down. As we have been saying now, the backup as for the Philippines based on the regression model is useful, yes, but it's not the regression for all the next one today. What you handle this company, which is an alternative way to handle that. There are many ways to handle this problem. Yeah, I'm curious whether you've thought about this and looked at the literature and also thought about benchmarking this approach to get a bit of a robustness test for the result that comes on the next slide, which I find interesting, but also not so intuitive in the end. And that's my second question, actually. Why is the premium for distributed firms so large? And yeah, previous commenters asked already that integrating the correct measure. Is that something that captures maybe too many elements because it's three letters, environmental, social, responsible, governmental. This is something that is a bit tricky. We want to is happening in all of it. Maybe you can also try to identify that a bit better by using some benchmarks that are available over time. Because that is another feature where I was wondering whether you have also checked how this is evolving over time, or is it snapshot or across the whole sample period. You have a longer period, how is it evolving over time? Because there are certain events I will go later on in my own presentation. That's the Paris Agreement, was a major event that changed a lot of investment behavior also on the financial market in general, and that's really also a feature. Sorry, it was a lot.
No. Your first suggestion is actually very helpful because now with this approach, because we start by carrying that issued by the same company on the same day, we end up with a pretty small sample. Which is always based on a relatively smaller sample. And yes, we haven't thought about using as the equity or equity as an important parameter, but we will try to. So now the second question was about.
So the second question was about why is the premium higher for the rest of the firm related to the labeling or what is the difference?
So now I'm thinking that we should have probably formulated the result in the opposite way. So first, and I have talked about this in the beginning, but I haven't showed the statistical results. So first, brown companies have more expensive debt generally. So both loan financing and bond financing is more expensive for brown companies. But then it turns out that basically for green companies, generally that is less expensive, but bond financing is cheaper. But for brown companies, the difference between the two is not that high. So basically, this comes from the public market. So both are more expensive, but the public market is for an average company, the public market is less expensive than for the brown company. About ESG ratings, we have run the results. We have run the tests using Jeffrey climate component, And the result, because that's the most common component of international, and the results are pretty much the same. So we decided to keep the main part of the paper to be the aggregate result, but perhaps climate would be more we're not looking on that. As for the greenwashing, absolutely this might be a concern. One of the advantages of referees is that we are taking announcements that are not coming from the company. So this is like somebody else, like a journalist or an NGO, has learned that a company has done something and they publish something. And so there is no like press releases that a company is. So there is no information coming from the company itself in the database. So this objective will be tried by so maybe concerns about greenwashing are not large in this scenario, but we haven't thought about greenwashing properly.
How this happened in Italy. And the story I'm going to tell you is about the effects of climate change through natural disasters and the application of financial investment across countries. So we start with motivation that climatic disasters are on the rise, both in terms of number of events and in terms of damages that introduce on the economy. But this increase is quite uneven across countries. It's more pronounced in some regions and less pronounced in other regions. So there is some heterogeneous impact on natural disasters worldwide. There is some anecdotal evidence that in relation, so right after very big events, we have seen some patterns related to portfolio flows, related to the economies in which these big events happen. This is just an example related to Typhoon that hit Philippines in 2013, and right after the typhoon, we saw a pattern of portfolio outflows from mutual fund investors from Philippines. This is just one motivating example for our questions who are actually do investors, international investors respond to climate-related natural disasters. And I'll show you that actually they respond in terms of their portfolio flows. Actually, what can be the rationale behind this effect? And one of these rationale is actually related, it seems to be related to some changing beliefs regarding the perception of future climatic risks on top of other reasons, of course. And actually, we also investigate whether disaster occurring in one country induce spillovers to other countries. So actually, there is a propagation of the effects of the disaster through financial investment. The empirical strategy is very easy. We employ a lot of projections, both in panel frameworks and in time series frameworks. The key dependent variable that we use is a measure of demand pressure, demand pressure on the side of financial investors. It's net portfolio flows, and I explain you how it's constructed. And on the right side, we have the natural disaster, the occurrence of the disasters at a high frequency. So we speak to three streams of the literature. The first one is the climate macrofinance, who already have the approach to the analysis of the macro effects of climate change from a global perspective. And also the climate finance literature that is really investigating the reaction of investors to climate-related events. Here, what we have in this literature is that we examine these global effects from the lens of financial investments. We explore some financial charters that can be considered a new thing in the macro literature. The second stream of literature is related to natural disasters, so papers investigating the effects of disaster with the growth rate of the economy. Here, we highlight the fact that there is a transmission channel with the government literature. And the third one is the literature on capital flows and flight to safety. In this literature, actually, this literature from a policy point of view has evaluated the importance of push and pull factors of capital flows in emerging market economies. Here, we have evidence that there is a pull factor that is related to natural disaster, And this pull factor influenced the idea of flight to safety, when this flight to safety is specifically related to climatic risk model. Okay, so briefly on the data, we use two main data sources. The first study is the EM is a very common used source of natural disasters, compiled by the University of Louvain. In this data set, they include only the larger disasters by the following criteria. So it's disasters that made more than 10 people or more than 100 affected people, or which the country has declared a state of emergency, or which it has called for international assistance. This data set provides the exact date of the disaster, the country the disaster occurred, and some characteristics, including the damages produced and some measure of the characteristics of the national. We merged this disaster data with the EPFR dataset. This is a dataset of financial investment in equity mutual funds that is actually that are refundable by the country. So actually this private company starts from fund level investment, and actually they based on the residency of the asset invested in by the mutual funds, actually rebundle these investments at country level. So what they sell is actually at weekly frequency, the portfolio flows, both in terms of inflows and outflows at country level, and of course also the stocks, so the asset under management at the end of the period for each country. This data set is weekly, and it also has some interesting breakdowns. So we merge these two and we end up with a sample, a panel that is country by week. It starts from 2009 because we are constrained by the availability of this EPFR data, and it ends in 2019. So, and with this merge, we end up with 39 countries that are 16 advanced economies and 23 emerging economies. So, as we are not just interested in the impact effect, the disasters, but also the dynamic effects. We employ analog projections, in which on the left-hand side we have a measure of accumulated net inflows in country I from P to P plus H, that is as commonly normalized by the asset under management with that. And on the right-hand side, we include the disaster as a dummy, as a weekly dummy. If at least one natural disaster occurs in country I in week P. And we also have a bunch of controls to this specification, and the controls we have are related to domestic controls like equity prices and volatilities, exchange rate with the dollars and other indicators. And actually, the fact that we include equity prices and financial market measures because actually the flows that are provided by EPFR are actually net of valuation effects. So they can be considered as a pure measure of demand pressure. So they don't incorporate the valuation effect that change what we measure. We include country level fixed effect and weekly dummy, and we estimate the input responses following the occurrence of one natural disaster in a week. And I'll show you three findings. This is the first finding. It's related to the direct effect of the disaster in the heat country. And we make this final estimate separately for the second advanced and emerging market economies. And this is what we find. So if we relate to disasters occurring in advanced economies, we don't see any effect on portfolio flows. While on the contrary, we see a fall in net inflows when disasters strike emerging market economies. And what about the magnitude of this effect? Actually, on the y-axis, you have actually percentage points. So the cumulative response after 8 weeks is of 0.1 percentage points. It is big or small. This happens to be quite big actually because this measure is net inflows over asset under management. This is a very small number that is on average at the previous like 0.16%. So after 8 weeks, you are declined by 0.1 percentage point. So it looks like kind of a big effect on equity portfolio flows, net portfolio flows in the country. Okay, so as we were talking about actually natural disasters, it's natural to investigate more the reason of this thing, and one thing that naturally arises that actually one wants to know if there is some climate-related reason behind this effect. And I'm talking about the commonly known behavioral effect of climate disaster, such that actually for investors that are inattentive to climate change in general, one disaster can be a sort of call on the longer climatic risk. There is a literature on this kind of starting to be by and actually in this setting we want to investigate whether these effects happens to be heterogeneous within the central emerging market economies based on the exposure of the example exposure of the country to climatic risk. So what we do actually, we split the emerging market economies in two groups: the high climatic risk and those at low climatic risk, based on this indicator that is constructed by the University of Notre Dame. It's a climate vulnerability index that is an annual index that is based on different measure, forward-looking measure of riskiness. They produce this index every year. This ranking is quite stable over time, but again, on the safer side, you will see there a pre-sample average and this before estimation sample. We actually consider countries that are above the median as high risk and those that are below the median low risk. And we rerun the same. Okay, this is a map of the countries. In red, you have the high climatic risk emerging market economies. As you can see, most of them are concentrated in Southeast Asia, but they're not just there. You have countries in Latin America, so South Africa. So we repeat the same estimates. We intersect on the emerging market economies, and we find that the result comes entirely from economies at high climatic risk. So there's no effect when a disaster occurs in the economies at low climatic risk. And you also can see the effects actually the magnitude of the state that we have found before, but the effect is temporary. So the cumulative effect reaches that track after 8 weeks, and then it goes back to baseline after 100 weeks. Okay, so finally number 2. So let's dig into the channel. So potentially the effects of the disaster can mix 2 different channels. One is the direct economic impact of the disaster that a priori might have an ambiguous sign on portfolio inflows, while ambiguous sign actually goes on one side. Investors might expect actually the one disaster that can pay damages also into the investment firms. So they can think that they can normally first investment firms, so they want to pull out money. They may want to pull out money from the country. On the other side, actually, a big disaster may have induced big public inflows into the country. Maybe the firms have not been damaged, so maybe they want to inject new funds because they first investment opportunities. The other side, the other channel is the climatic risk channel that I explained before. The next channel has a negative side, in fact, because actually if investors update the beliefs of climatic riskiness, actually they want to reduce their exposure to climatic risk, so their exposure in climatic risk. So to isolate this channel is the suggestive evidence. We explore the effects of disasters to unaffected countries that are in the same region and are classified at the same level. So actually, if for example you have a natural disaster in Indonesia, I want to see what happens to net inflows to my region. It is the same region and it's also that one. So same framework as before, we just substitute the damping with a different damping that is equal to 1 of the disaster happens in one of the neighboring country, but not in country A. Why not in country A? Because we want to discard all situation in which the disaster was like a systemic phenomenon in the region. This can be different characteristics and can be our analysis. So the disaster is not one, if there's at least one disaster in another country. in the same region, but not in the same country. And this is the effect that we find. So actually, disaster reduce the net inflows to unaffected hydrometrics countries in the same region. And as you look at this input response, when you compare it with this one on the left-hand side, you notice two things. Actually, the effect is larger and is much more persistent. So one thing that this is not proof, but actually it suggests that maybe the direct effect can be on positive side, and this can be related to the fact that the change in the climatic period by itself can create a larger decline of these inflows. That this decline might be persistent, and the fact that this decline is persistent is consistent with our changing preferences regarding risk. Of course, it's not a bulletproof. It's just a story, but it looks like it's working. So we want to include an additional control with these trade linkages, because actually, if you have this disaster in Indonesia, you may want to pull out money from Malaysia, not because you are thinking about climate change, but maybe because you know that they are very tightly linked from a trade perspective. So you think that this disaster will be imported in Malaysia, and you will have revenue losses in your portfolio because of the disaster, without actually changing your mind as you have risk. So we want to exclude this possibility. So we can include an additional control, it's an interaction term with our downgrade with bilateral trade rates with between two countries. And the idea is that actually the trade linkages can equal, the falling net inflows can be proportional to trade linkages in the country. So by including this interaction term, nothing changes. So then it seems that this interaction with these trade linkages have not matter for our story. And overall, the result on the left-hand side remains the same. So same story. So this climatic risk channel seems to be alive and well in the mind of global investors. Finding number three, am I running out? Finding number three. So what happens to other countries? Actually, if you have a disaster in a high-risk country, are there changing inflows to advanced economies or to safer places in general? So investors may want to pull out money and do it now. Or maybe they want to reshuffle their investment in other countries. Of course, we just have data on equity mutual funds, so we don't know the whole story, but at least we can explore whether they do that within the same asset class that we have. And this also provides an additional test of our behavioral channel, because we want to see whether these funds actually possible increase in net inflows, go in countries that are safer from a climatic risk standpoint. So this is what we do. We explore this thing in two ways. One is a simple time series model projection that pulls all the accumulated aggregate inflows to all advanced economies on the left-hand side. On the right-hand side, we have mean there is at least one disaster in one group of the advanced economies. Of course, group I am referring to high climatic risk and low climatic risk countries. And from this exercise, actually, we have a result that is consistent with what we found before, actually. So disasters in high climatic risk emerging market economies induce an increase in net inflows to advanced economies, while disasters occurring in low climatic risk emerging markets do not induce any change in net inflows to these advanced economies. So these results pair to the direct effect that we found in result number one. But actually, we want to investigate more this thing, and we resort to the same frame, the same panel of the projection that we had at the beginning. Now we do that for the set of advanced economies. So we have net inflows to a country that is within the set of advanced economies. We want to see what is the effect of disaster in a high climatic risk emerging market. But now we are interested to these two additional interaction terms. So we want to see whether this effect is larger in depending on the climatic riskiness of the receiving country and depending on the insurance coverage of the receiving country. So actually, whether global investors are not just flying away from the hit country, but actually they are also selecting their reinvestment place based also on the riskiness and resilience, overall resilience of the receiving country. We use for climatic risk, we use the same indicator that we used before to split the countries, but now we use it to level and we interact with the dummy. So the climatic index for the macroeconomics multiplied by the dummy of the disaster. And we use the non-life insurance premium over GDP, with the variable compiled by the World Bank and including the IMF financial dashboard as a proxy of climatic insurance coverage. So in this case, we're interested in the impulse response of eta H and theta H. This is what I will show in the next slide. So on the left-hand side, we have the reduction of the nominal climatic risk, and on the right-hand side, the impulse response to the interaction of the insurance coverage. And as you can see, the spillovers are smaller. The larger the climatic riskiness of the recipient and past economies, and they are larger, the higher the insurance coverage of the recipient of economies. So it looks like actually investors are also, if it's true that investors have a kind of wake up call on the risks, the climatic risks, they are not just updating their view relating to the gift country, but also at the global level, they actually are rethinking their investment strategies, considering this risk at global level. But what are the risky countries that we're talking about? So I just actually include a ranking of the two rankings of the advanced economies based on the indicators from safer to riskier countries from a climatic risk standpoint. On the left-hand side, we have a list of countries based on insurance coverage from high to low, and on the right-hand side, we have countries based on the climatic risk index from low to high. As you can see, actually, when it comes to climatic risk, the concept of safe haven is a bit different than what you have in mind in case of times of crisis, in the sense that usually known safe havens like UK and Japan look quite different in this case. So, for example, the UK and Canada have a high insurance coverage and a low climatic risk, so they can be considered as climatic safe havens, so to say. While on the opposite extreme, you have Japan, that has a low insurance coverage and a high climatic risk. So it's kind of a climatic risk safe haven. The United States is actually in between because they are highly insured, but they also have a high climatic risk. So in the US and Germany are in between these two extremes in terms of riskiness, in terms of safe haven view in terms of climate change. Okay, so with a lot of robustness checks, operation of the baseline related to actually we apply a strict interpretation of climatic events, so we use different data for polygons, alternative indicators of climatic risk and insurance. We use the damages or GDP. Actually, we don't use this variable in the baseline because on one side it restricts a lot the sample, on the other side actually these damages are estimated as cost. Usually after 1 week. So the investors in the week of the disaster do not know exactly what will be the damages, euro damages in the country. So they of course they know if the disaster is big or small, but damages are not really a good proxy, and also they are not really comparable across countries because there can be incentives to declare either damages to have an insurance system, so it's quite tricky to use this variable. We just made a robustness to see how it works. We added additional controls, and we actually started to investigate some investors breakdown to see whether retail and institutional investor react in different ways or active versus passive. just finished. The conclusion are that natural disaster reduce portfolio closely related market economies that are at high climatic, that already labeled at high climatic risk. Investors seek to create their beliefs on country and global climatic risk, and they fly away from the risky countries going to advanced economies. But when they go to advanced economies, actually they select that they prefer to grow more in countries that are also safer within the set of advanced economies. And this can have kind of policy implication because as you know, natural disasters are becoming more frequent and intense with climate change, so this can have an effect on the volatility of capital flows in relation to this. I'll stop here. And thanks for asking. Let's see what's
We have a minute question.
Yeah, so I mean, if you want to make an argument for climate change, then I would say climate change risk. Then I would say that not all natural disasters come from climate change. Like there are volcano eruptions, there are earthquakes and stuff like that. Probably several. So then you could take them out, and your results should not be present for those, I guess. Then, so that's just a suggestion.
Yeah, actually, we made a robustness using all these strictly climatic events, and the results do not change actually. So from one point of view, I agree with you actually. I'm not sure that investors have in mind what are strictly disasters that are strictly related to weather and climate, and disasters that are not climate related. And also in the scientific literature, I'm not sure that actually earthquakes, volcano eruptions are totally unrelated to climate. So it's kind of a work in progress. As far as I understand, I'm not a scientist, so I agree with you that there are some type of natural events that are really climate related, like floods and landslips. But actually, yes, the results will not change.
So if Connie's right, then I mean there should be a stronger one, right? So once you take those unclimate related events out, your results should even become stronger because that mechanism that you're alluding to shouldn't be there for those types of events, right? So if you kind of have the average over related and unrelated events, and you take the unrelated out, what remains in sample should have even larger effects.
Honestly, I don't think that we want larger effects. These effects we have provided. They're really the same. So actually, the effects is really the same as far as we find. So maybe it doesn't matter if it's a disaster related to climate change or not related to climate change. The mind of investor actually they do not find, and somehow they go back to disaster, future risks or other disasters.
Nice analysis. I have a question on ethics rates. We're seeing are environmental modeling evaluation.
Yes. It takes up also effects movements. They are expressed in dollars or pounds.
So that was one question because that's 600 additional environmental inside. Yeah, it's one. Where you put your clients projects, then you should also take them about some of the other variables. But you have a lot of interesting variables in macro-financial variables. Maybe it's a useful way of thinking about what will be the environmental reaction to the other that are more moving like the industrial production faster reacting to the horizon.
Yeah, in principle, we can do this also with other projections. But of course, we can investigate the effects on industrial production, but this would go more into the direction of exploring the effects of the macroeconomic effects on the country, but here we're trying to explore the global implications in the country. So yes, of course, we can.
Very, very last question.
If I may, also as a former investor in many of the countries that you've mentioned exactly during that time period, I would say a couple of maybe variables to control for. So the macro environment over 2019, we had two major global macro perspectives because it was the beginning of the tightening cycle of advanced central banks, and then we have the commodity prices in 2015-16. So if we infer from that the fact that there is a located natural disaster and therefore neighboring countries, even if non-affected, also suffer portfolio outflows, that might be a long stretch because the global macro environment might be such that the dollar is strong and therefore Asia FX, for instance, is weakening, and therefore investors just want to pull out of Asia FX altogether. The other control variables is there a policy response? If the central bank locally will ease, then portfolio investors in bonds will actually want to buy these bonds and reallocate from stocks. Also, on the bond side, we need to look into hard currency dollar bonds because that's not going to be captured in portfolio flows. And investors might want to buy the dollar bonds instead of the local currency bonds.
Thanks. So regarding the first comment, actually, so this might, in principle, actually, we are capturing. So using this local projection, local projection, you have downward is equal to 1 in different times in different countries. So in principle, you are capturing just the effect of the disaster and not any other macroeconomic things that are behind the disaster. You have time downwards. And capturing sort of larger trends that are global or at least common across countries.
But because the sample data is relatively small, for instance, comparing Indonesia and Malaysia, one is a high yielding country with a capacity to hedge the FX. The other is relatively low yielding, illiquid with challenges to hedge the FX. So the investors' response to these two countries will be different also, just by the nature of that. For instance.
Okay, let's talk about it. And related to the other question, actually, we also have data on bond funds. So we can explore this other dimension. Actually, there is also not just some switch from one country to the other, but also from within the same country from having the bonds. We can explore this.
It's very good work. Thank you.
It's Friday, it's 5 p.m. So me and Matthias are the only ones that are staying in the So this is work with Rudolfs, Bems, Lukas, Boehnert, and Andrea Pescatori. The usual disclaimer applies. These are only for use. So the clean energy transition requires a substantial decline in fossil fuel consumption and production around the world. For example, for crude oil, the net zero emission scenario from the International Energy Agency says that we would need a 75% decline in global oil extraction until 2050. And as a result, many oil-producing countries will see persistent and strong declines in the fossil fuel sector. The question of our paper is, what could be the macroeconomic impacts of these strong and persistent declines in fossil fuel? And this is a non-trivial question. There's a large literature on the Dutch disease and resource curves. Basically says if you have a growing resource sector, growing fossil fuel sector, then you reduce your growth rate over the medium run. Here, of course, we have the inverse, the reverse. We have a shrinking extractive sector. And there's simply no studies on this in terms of what the impact is on the macroeconomy. And so this is the contribution of our paper, is really to study this empirically. So, and we do this by identifying 35 episodes of persistent and exogenous declines in extractive activity in a sample of 122 countries. So to basically boil it down to these 35 episodes. And then we use local projections to study the impact of these persistent and strong decline episodes on various macroeconomic variables. And there are three key takeaways here. The first is that we find strong and persistent detrimental effects on real GDP. So in a decline episode where extraction declines by 40%, the quantity of extraction declines by 40% over 10 years. In this case, real GDP declines by 7%. It's pretty significant. We only find modest real exchange rate depreciation. So in the same, with the 40% decline in extraction activity, we only get a real exchange rate depreciation of about 20%. And this real exchange rate depreciation is not strong enough to really incentivize reallocation from the extractive sector to other tradable goods sectors in the economy. Overall, we don't find something like a reverse resource curve. It's effectively negative and persistent. And we have a small open economy neoclassical model trying to motivate and explain these results. And these results are really in line more with a model where economic agents do not fully anticipate the decline in extractive activity in their countries. So major roadblock, of course, for our exercise is simultaneity and limited variables. So when we think about the impact of these declines in extraction activity on macroeconomic variables, there will be episodes where there is an omitted variable, like let's say a civil war, that drives down both the extraction of fossil fuel, but also, of course, the macroeconomy and agriculture. Think about Syria. And so this is something that, of course, we take very seriously. And to address this, we basically have three steps here. So first, we use statistical methods to really narrow down all these episodes that we have to only those extraction decline episodes where we have 20% decline in extractive activity. So the quantity of extraction that declines by 20% from peak to trough. And then afterwards, the production has to stay low for at least 5 years. So it has to be relatively consistent. And this way, we get about 150 different episodes of declines in extraction activity. The second step is that we narrow down the number of episodes by looking at how large the value of these declines is relative to GDP. So basically, if a country has a relatively small sector compared to GDP, think about Germany and the phase out of coal mining there, we basically throw it out of the sample. That's important because somehow this biases our sample towards those countries where the extractive sector is meaningful. But with this step, we narrow it down from 150 episodes to about 70. And that third, we have this step where we use narrative identification, and when we look at the circumstances of each of these episodes, and we only retain two different types of episodes. One, episodes where we find that there's a depletion of the resource, or for whatever reason, the marginal costs went up. So one example is a chart in the early 2000s, where simply the oil reserves got depleted, and that's why production declined. The second type of episodes that we retain are those where domestic policies are imposed specifically on the mining or extractive sector. For example, nationalization of mines or higher taxes. One example is Suriname in 1974. They imposed much higher taxes on the bauxite mining, and as a result, production declined by about 30% over the next 5 years. So we exclude everything that is related to wars, structural transition periods, think about the breakup of the Soviet Union, for example, or macroeconomic crisis more broadly that then also affect the mines. Or we get this out, and so we boil it down to 35 episodes here. Of course, anticipation could be an issue here. And what we do is we look into the IMF staff reports for all of these countries. And typically these reports include everything that is macro relevant for it. So if oil is macro relevant for a country, there will be a projection for the production of oil. And typically these reports are done jointly with the governments, the national governments, so they provide the data and the projections and so on. And what we find is that most of these episodes were actually not anticipated. So in the case of Chad, the government knew that maybe at some point oil production would decline, but they did not see it coming within the next 5 years. So these are the summary statistics for the different episodes that we have here. There are 4 key takeaways. The first is that about half of our 35 episodes of extraction declines are related to oil, and the other half is relatively a diverse set of commodities, including minerals, bauxite, copper, but also natural gas and silver, tin, and zinc. The second key takeaway is that the declines from peak to trough are actually quite sizable. So you see on average, they are 45% for crude oil, and more than 99% for this case of zinc. The third takeaway is that the decline in the value of extraction is very heterogeneous here. So you see on average for crude oil, the decline in the value here is about 10 billion, whereas for zinc it's like 95 billion. So there's a lot of heterogeneity. And then the fourth takeaway is that these decline episodes are actually pretty long. So from peak to trough, on average in crude oil, they're about 9 years. So it's pretty long. And then afterwards, they have to be down or low, this extraction at least for another 5 years. So this is relatively consistent. Let me tell you, for almost all of these episodes, production never goes up again. So once we have these 35 episodes, we then use the standard global projections from Schroeder, and basically on the left-hand side here we have the cumulative percentage deviation of the respective macro variables, real GDP, could be exports, imports, and so on. And then we have here on the right-hand side we have the exogenous change in extraction. And this is a fitted value. Here we have a first stage where we normalize these extraction decline episodes. And then we also include lags to account for autocorrelation. We include country fixed effects to account for structural differences across countries, and also time effects to account for global business cycle and also global ups and downs in commodity prices. So here's the key result from our baseline regression. So again, the typical or the normalized decline that we use here has a 10% decline in the quantity of extraction. And then after 10 years, it declines to about 40% compared to the original, the peak of extraction. And the impact on real GDP is after 10 years, minus 7%. And you see this impact is very, very persistent. And let me tell you again, so it's really in the first year it declined by 10%, and then it's a gradual decline. It's not like falling off the cliff. Typically, for these oil production or copper production, it's a gradual decline in. Then we look, or we try to better understand what is going on here. So why are these effects so persistent and so relatively large? And so we look into the domestic sector and in the externals. Let's start with the domestic sector again. So here you see the impact of these decline episodes on real consumption. And what's notable is that during the first 4 years, or 5 years, it's not much of a significant effect. And so this is in line with the story. This is what we show also in this new classical macro model. This is in line with the story where economic agents see, oh, they believe this is just a temporary decline, so they do consumption sweep. They don't reduce their consumption. Then only after like 4 or 5 years, they realize, oh, this is maybe more persistent, and then they start reducing their consumption. And this is exactly what we find in these IMF reports. It takes typically 3 to 4 to 5 years before the countries, including the IMF, realize, oh, there's maybe a more persistent decline in the resource extraction of that perspective. Then we also use studying real investment. Here, there's also not much of a significant impact, maybe a little bit here after 4 years. So coming to the external sector, most of these countries export their production of fossil fuels or metals. And so what we see here is that real exports decline about 8% in these countries. At the same time, real imports, again, are not much impacted. And that's again in line with the story where economic agents just don't reduce their consumption, particularly during the first 4 or 5 years. And so this means that the trade balance deteriorates on these countries. And then we have here the impact on the real exchange rate. And so the real exchange rate depreciates about 20% after 10 years, but it's insignificant. And it's also not enough to really incentivize reallocation from the extractive sector to other tradable goods sectors in the economy. And we can see this in the next slide, where we look at the effects across industries. So here we have the impact on mining, on the mining sector, and of course there's a relatively steep decline of 15%. And of course these countries also produce other goods, or they're producing other commodities. And so this is why it's like 15%. Then you have manufacturing, and we see that there is even a decline. It's a relatively persistent decline. And the same is for services. And I think the underlying mechanism here is that the exchange depreciation is not strong enough to offset these declines from the mining sector, but there are also spillovers, negative spillovers from the mining sector to manufacturing and services. It's manufacturing that is producing goods as inputs into the mining sector, or services that are produced as input into the mining sector. They are, of course, also suffer. And if we do a whole bunch of robustness analysis, we find that these effects are quite heterogeneous. So the impacts are far stronger even for low-income countries, and for countries, of course, with large extractive sectors. And then we also look into the effect on institutions. We find that reducing, because there is this hypothesis that with the resource curves, the quality of institutions goes down, and that's why you have this negative impact of rising extraction on growth. We don't find the reverse effect here. So even if you shrink your extractive sector, it does not improve the institutions in your country. So the conclusions are here that first, we find that these exogenous persistent declines in extracted quantities, they lead to these permanent negative level shifts in real GDP. And one of the reasons is that the real exchange rate does not adjust enough to offset also the negative impacts or spillover effects from these extraction declines to the manufacturing sector and also the services. And then we also have this model, this neoclassical or macroeconomic model that is kind of our results are in line with the model where economic agents do not fully anticipate this extraction. So overall, the policy implication is that countries that are transitioning away from fossil fuel production would probably be good to make this very predictable and so that firms can highly anticipate these changes, firms and households, over a longer period of time instead of making rash and unpredictable decisions. So thank you so much for your attention, and I look forward to your questions.
Yeah, sure. Okay, so yeah, so I thought this was very interesting. I had just one comment when it comes to climate change again. So there are differences between oil and coal, for instance. So oil is exported, whereas coal is like locally extracted and used locally and not exported. So there might be, and coal is actually the main problem when it comes to global warming. So there might be a difference there. I just want to make that point.
Honestly, coal is even not in the data set.
No, exactly.
Because the value of the production of coal typically is relatively small compared to the raw GDP, even in some of these emerging markets. I would disagree on the, or not disagree, but the IEA energy transition scenario, they still have a 75% decline in oil production over the next 30 years. So I think it may also affect these countries that are producing oil, at least according to the scenario.
Yeah, no, I'm not saying that, but I think many of us who have looked at this carefully think that most of the conventional oil will in fact be used, sold and used. But I mean, so that's.
I mean, one takeaway could be here, because coal does not even show up in our sample, that probably the impact from reducing coal should be relatively small macroeconomic impacts. Right? So there are studies on the regional impacts of phasing out coal, and I think there you find sizable impacts on the regional economy, but at the macroeconomy, probably not very large.
All of the coal, just thinking about the notion of consumption change. But in terms of the industries that are slowing down, like the labor share, I think that the oil is very happy. So then the question is like, why is it still possible? How much is it that labor in the short run? So maybe that gets to your point that you start seeing consumption show up later on, but there's a spillover towards the manufacturing and service sector. So just in terms of the macro model, I mean, should we be surprised not seeing a lot going on with consumption in the first slow down in the extract industry? If the share is quite low, and along those lines, I guess I'm also thinking how it's going to affect government, which may be having to pay for some kind of expenditure, and we're talking that as well. And again, so just trying to think kind of where the spillovers are, and also then it gets to the ultimate question, which I think you're after, which is the adjustment in the medium and long term. About how the industry, how the structure changes would affect mobility across sectors, variation in housing, and then really think more deeply about what are impulse on housing population, and the transition economies. So that's the other point where I say not much going on initially as well.
Yeah, so this is in line with the story that is that I mean, this is kind of a, I'm not sure if it's an internal additional explanation is that these sectors tend to be very capital intense. And then even maybe if these mines also they still keep on producing, they just reduce their output. So it may also not be that they kind of let all labor go at that point. So I think you're right that could be another channel of why the consumption response is not needed. You also have it broken out the public. Yeah, so this is private and public consumption, and so you see that, and this is where so there is some impact on private, and it's not really significant, but it kicks in after 6 years. But then for these countries, public consumption does not go down, and that's where you would actually expect some impact because these countries should have lower tax revenue.
One question was really the same. I wanted to see the effect on the private trade in Australian parts. One clarification of the shock, actually, you said that it's a shock that has seen a reduction of 10% on impact, right? And then it reaches 40% after 10 years. This is the dynamic of the shock, right? So it goes for the shock is 10%, and it's perceived as a permanent shock from the side of the world, or at least actually it's perceived as a permanent shock after a while.
Yes,
that's why. And actually, the second question is where this extractive sector has a different way with different countries. So there can be a way to weight the shock with the way the sectors and the country.
This is something we do in this heterogeneity here. It's the larger effect for low-income countries, but you're after the sector size. You can see that in countries with a larger sector, the impact is about 10% decline, which is much larger than for countries with smaller sectors, where it's a little bit more. We also do as robustness where we kind of take out each of the episodes to check that it's not driven by one or two big episodes. So we have done a huge amount of robustness.
So the first one is, to what extent do you think your results can be used to think about the overall welfare implications from reducing mostly like oil production and shifting towards geographically motivated in the beginning, towards net zero, because you are looking at for the countries that have to reduce extraction. The reason to do the job, but maybe even for these countries in the longer term, like I don't know how much we can we have. So maybe in the longer term, we still see an overall welfare increase, or maybe for the whole world, it still would be beneficial in the long run to transition away from oil. And the second, I think it would be very interesting to reconcile your results, but there is a paper by Sergey Sarkisyan, Boehnert, and all this Lewis. It's called the Great Carbon Arbitrage. And they are actually looking at phasing out coal from the overall world's welfare perspective. And they compute, that's why they call arbitrage, they compute the overall welfare improvement from phasing out coal, and like they do consider like, shorter term GDP jobs and everything, but they also consider new jobs and new sources of energy and everything like that. So there actually is a paper on coal from the overall world welfare perspective. So I think it would be interesting to reconcile your view.
So you were asking about the persistence of the effect. So here so before I think short performance for the 10th year. If you look at to the 20-year horizon, it goes up a little bit, but it's still like 4% after 20 years. So it's still quite quite sizable, I would say. The question on welfare, this is something we can address with this framework. I will definitely look that paper up and tie it into it.
Yeah, actually, it's in the IMF working papers, serious authors.
IMF has so many people, we hired 60 people just working on climate change, and I have a hard time to track. But I will definitely look it up. We are trying to kind of provide some empirical results for one part, one puzzle part. Okay, so thank you so much very much.
This is work done with my former colleague Fiscal, and thanks a lot to the organizers for inviting me to present this. Yeah, let me say the views expressed here on our side as well as what is this work about? The non-exploitation, the anti-unification of climate. This is part of a larger scheme of work in the central bank. It is more or less a spin-off from a framework where we try to put together not only non-banks but also banks. The idea that we have in front of you when we probably discussing the climate ideas, so it's a more expensive model where we combine the network, all financial institutions, where we have data with granular information, especially to see what the implications of implication effectively given a certain shock. And this specific paper looks now into the subset of investment funds only, where we try to have different types of plan with this shock to see what would be the implication given the first initial shock. So it's more about short-term reaction, and also on the long-term view, which is like the message from the NGS perspective. We try to focus here on scenarios that we see, also the confidence what is the view on these more longer term shocks. Maybe just briefly, or introduction of the role of investment funds as a sector. Very large, growing essentially and are corporations, banks in one rank number following banks, and therefore it is important from the perspective of the financial system to look into the effective climate change for this specific sector. The problem with investment funds is they are the least regulated sector compared to banks and corporations, for instance, and therefore methodologies to stress them and to understand what's happening given a certain shock scenario, which is common in the literature for stress banks. We know they're not with a long time what to do to figure out how a bank would fail or the system would get into trouble. But here the methodology is less most importantly, most existing models actually fail to take join the sector main transmission channels and the strength of overlapping portfolios and market cross holdings and fund shares. That is something that's very repeated in the fund sector, because the regulation allows the fund to hold shares of another fund, and there are no limits to that. And that hides also the information. And yeah, why is it important to look at funds? Funds, given their size, sometimes in terms of financing, are key for the green transition. But as we discussed already earlier, it's difficult also to understand how green are they. Labels are a bit patchy. There's a lot of greenwashing, excluding criteria for certain investments are not clear across the world, and so on. And yeah, what we find basically is that short-term climate shocks may have potential to decrease the instability of the financial system. They are not mitigated, and yeah, what we can see according to the current literature, which is exploding. There are few results available regarding funds reaction to this type of short-term shock, and that's our attempt to provide that. And Now, what do we do? This is just a graphical overview of what is practically behind our system. So we generate a new relationship of all funds in our system. They will securities. These securities are issued by interest in real economy, and we map them climate risk to those cases in real economy where we have different data. More detail. Now, what do we do to run simulation? Taking this data effect, there are steps. We assume what this means in terms of the income, so we think about a variety of several means and ends, so there's nothing specific, not like the fancy responding, really getting down to the frequency, but it's all analysis. Now, what we do is first step, we have an adjustment to our total net assets. So this is net asset value in this context for a given fund after a shock, and we try then to find an equilibrium price given the linkages from cross holdings and also the governance defaults, principles of fund share, because it's possible in our setup. The fund they also their value goes. Then we have a redemption shock, so we allow some investors to redeem part of the shares that they hold. And the market shock, and we have also version where the small market shock, and we integrate the feature of a lesser sensitivity of sustainable life investors in these context. Then we allow for fire sales, so that's classic in the literature or contagion. Where funds first determine the level of cash that they want to have, and then sell or buy securities, asset and then price impact. Function that allows us to have a shift in prices, given sales and purchases, and these effects in the market securities, all holdings, all fund holdings, and all the system. And just briefly in terms of limitation, so any investment funds that invest in traded assets, is metrics of traded asset portfolios, R's metrics of funds, various cross holdings, and then we have C as cash, L as loans, E as some assets. That allows us to generate a measure of equity of funds to A, and then it's the sum of the variables that are A, R, C, and B minus the loans. And we consider them period T1 where market assets can change in value or traded but without fund flows. Now also another thing that is important here, how does the market shock translate to A? So if the fund I changes as a result of market shock, this impacts the value of its shares held by external investors, but also the value of fund, so which is held by fund J. So this is not just explain the problem that we are facing, which is twofold. So there can be mutual feedback between two funds that are linked in both ways by investment relations. The other is that investment funds that are leveraged can be for the process as the value of other funds they will increase, causing their own equity to become linked. So this is something that we address. What's important here in this context is that we basically make sure that each fund is not fully owned by other funds. This is a small extension of Heisenberg rate. Now, so in terms of data, what we do is we have not PFR, in our case it's relatively. We also have PFR, but for this specific purpose, relatively is better because it's fund specific and has the advantage that we have information, granular information of their holdings in isolate. And that allows us actually to bring this data set together with other information that we have from the centralized securities database, which includes
millions of securities and the RIA database, which allows us to identify institutions and their affiliates. This is at least in Europe, it's an easy way to map institutions with labels and custody level information. What we have is we have a snapshot of data that covers 23,000 funds, and we use specific snapshot from in 2019. We have also other months available. Our results have been also tested with these other months. They do not change much. We describe this in the paper. Then the other two important sources that we have in there, we are our knowledge quite unique because we combine for funds information from Argentina, which gives us information at the firm level in terms of carbon entities, so this is for 1 and 2 emissions. And we use also information from 457 for physical risk. And there we have the firm level ratings over different categories, risk related to floods, wildfires, water stress, and so on. And based on these two types of data sets, we do some kind of shock and stress resistance. I will show you this in a second. And to give you an idea what is the potential for contagion, we have generated here two small charts that show you two different aspects. So on the left-hand side, you see the portfolio overlap by average cosine similarity. So that's just a measure of similarity. And what you can see here is all of our funds group into 10 different deciles. That means we have to split them into even groups. In our case here on the left-hand side, there should be around 1,300 funds in each decile. And what it shows is basically what is the overlap between these different fund groups in terms of portfolio. And what you can see is that the first decile, so this is the part here on the top, is actually having almost no overlap, so that this light green color and the darker it gets stronger the overlap. However, when we move in from the decile 6 to 10, which are the more brown firms, you see that there is some overlap also here with greener firms, and that gives potential for contagion effects. When you look at the cross holdings, this is here expressed in this right-hand side chart. You see basically cross holdings in terms of nominal values. You have that across all of these 10 different deciles, but there is a category that we call NC, so that means not classified. And this is for all funds where we have for less than 50% of the portfolio scoring based on the Sergey Sarkisyan 27 database. And this is actually a fairly large fraction, and that also includes funds of funds. And that will be also important later on. So they have, therefore, because these funds of funds rather large overlap. Now, this was just the motivation. Now, I explained briefly what kind of shocks to be used to stress our system. And we have 5 different shocks. The first one is just the uniform shock. I don't show this to you now, but it's just for transparency. So we use this as a benchmarking. So that means it's uniform across all firms, and we just want to see how our model reacts given such uniform shocks, and to compare it also with other types of shocks. Then we have a shock coming from redemptions of investors. Just the idea behind that they might require more information on the carbon intensity of fund portfolio. For instance, commercial data provider changes the classification and has made a big effort to get some new information, and this might change the whole labeling, and this would be could lead to a redemption shock. Then the other alternative is a transition risk market shock. So that would be a shock that is a bit similar to the second one, but in number 2, we don't have any change in the market prices. Number 3 would also have an effect on the assets based on the carbon intensity of the issue.
And number 4, which is a physical market risk shock, there we have an effect on asset prices based on physical risk exposure issues. And the last step, and that is a bit similar to some of the things that we have seen earlier, there we try to simulate what would be the effect of extreme weather events in the very short term, materializing across several countries. And now coming back to the motivation, why it would be also just a pure redemption shock. So this is just time series overview where we use EPFR now instead of Refinitiv to show you for SRIs or socially responsible investors in ESG funds and for other funds. Other funds are purple and the other side green. On the left-hand side, we see this for equity funds, and on the right-hand side for bond funds. What is actually happening after the signature of the Paris Agreement, which was in April 2016? And what we can see is that at least for those funds that are labeled as green or socially responsible, there is a huge spike in terms of flows. For other funds, you see a small decline here. But it is not very strong. And for one fund, there is not much. But that's just for the other funds. And now what we do in the next step is actually we try to simulate now what would happen in terms of foundation when an event takes place that hits those different deciles with the redemption shock. And we calibrate that in such a way that we have here grouping into 5 quintiles, in each quintile is a different level of redemption. The first one has an outflow of 1%, the second of 4.5%, the third quintile of 0, and then the fourth of 0.5, and the fifth of 5%. And fourth, and so this is reflected in this left-hand side chart. So where we mention what is the change, where we show what is the change in terms of what is the net flows relative to total net assets. And then on the right-hand side, we show indirect gains, and gains can be positive or negative, and we distinguish then between price impact gains and gains from cross-border. And you can see here across these different deciles what is the reaction. And this is in this case not one-to-one in line with what you see here. So you have only for the first decile price impact gains. You have then an increase in terms of losses. For the other segments, there are only price impacts, so evaluations of the funds total net assets that take place. And for the non-classified category, you have a small impact from cross-holding, but that is related to not a change that comes from the price impact, because these category, as I said before, that includes a lot of other funds. Now, the next result shows now the effect from another scenario that has now the market price impact as well. So this is the carbon intensity shock you can see here on the left-hand side. Again, what is the gain or the loss across these different deciles? And what we do here is basically we use security level information. And we have for each security also the historical information or data set where we that allow us then to map the carbon intensity of the issuer of the given security to different quantiles that we basically use to sample the parametric distribution of the issuer's past returns. In words, you have for each security, you have quantile, and then you know what is the carbon intensity that is mapped in those historical returns, and then you can generate a shock base. That's a very simplified way of generating a shock. But this is just to show what would be result using vector data. It's not like the idea was not to have a sophisticated scenario translation because we can only use other tools. This is not the purpose here. And this heterogeneity then translates into net flows. For this, we use the so-called flow performance relationship that is convex in this case, meaning that investors tend to move into funds that are having a higher performance, while funds with lower performance have a smaller flow impact. And what you can see here is that the overall impact in terms of magnitude into this complex performance relationship is stronger for the first two deciles, given the initial direct gains, than for the rest of the deciles here. So that's one result. And then in terms of cross holdings, market gains and gains from cross holdings in the last iteration, you see again that the category of non-classified funds has the strongest effect. And that comes again from all the market gains that are materializing here, which are affecting the funds of fund sector. And moving on, this is just an illustration of the same result, but with a cloud across all funds. Given the fact was 5 minutes left, just take away brown funds are the brownish here, and green funds are green. These are the non-classified ones. You see here on the x-axis initial market shock, and on the y-axis contagion effect, and you see what this is like. Now, this is the result of physical risk. So the physical risk will be the same thing. At the issuer level, we have information about physical risk exposures. And one takeaway, and given the time now, is that here in this case, you see a rather homogeneous picture. So direct gains, even for the first two deciles, are not positive. There are losses here. And they are stronger than for the third to the seventh decile. Why is that? So that's maybe a bit counterintuitive. And one of the reasons in this case is that, first of all, physical risk exposure data is a bit more limited than the carbon intensity data. And then second, physical risk exposure in general is a bit more limited than carbon intensity and in terms of impact. And given that many funds have in our classification system only a fraction of issuers in their portfolio that have strong physical risk exposure that leads to an impact, the overall impact is spread evenly, and there might be funds that have, due to the fact that their volatility in the historical distribution was rather large, then a rather stronger impact. So these are two components that are. And then, yeah, so it's the same result again for the non-classified funds, the cross-holding effect being the strongest, but across the board of these three dimensions, you see that this is rather homogeneous. In the overall, the results are weaker than for carbon index. Now, the last part, and that's something where we go now into a different group. So we use about flow performance relationships, and this summarizes the impact of what would happen if you have a physical risk event that is materializing at the country and firm level. That is, in our case, not deterministic as before, but simulated. So we use here Monte Carlo simulation to basically see what would be the impact across these different categories that are listed here. So floods, heat stress, hurricanes, water stress, wildfire. The overall overall strength of this index is also important, but what you can see is that heat stress, water stress, and wildfire have the largest dispersion across funds. So that's like say one of the main takeaways. One additional thing is we look at something that we call indirect severity. So this is basically the ratio of the impact from this specific shock that you see on the left-hand side over a uniform shock. And if this gives us a more neutral benchmark to see what is the effect. The uniform shock is what I mentioned before, so that we just have the cost of all the states. And let me conclude now, given that I have just 1 minute left. One thing that we observed, and this was something that we show in the paper, but it's still a key message, that's why I listed here. Investment funds have portfolios that are tilted towards risky assets compared to the general real economy sample. So meaning they are in general, when it comes to climate risk, more risky than the overall market average. So we compare this to all securities that we have in our sample, and then the securities held by investment funds. If you look at those two, you see that investment funds are more risky, but also the financial market in general. If you compare it to just real economy sample, you exclude all financial. Now, the other thing is that the second order effects are of a moderate magnitude overall, but still material when the initial shocks are large. So that depends on how you define your shocks. As I have explained, you have not been making an effort here to have the most precise shock, but it's more to show what would happen if you have a heterogeneous shock across this sample of funds. Then transition shocks are somewhat absorbed overall, but this is less the case for shocks from political risk. So within our overall cross section, there is no natural joint risk mitigation, meaning across brown and green funds, they get hit. This is a result of what I showed you for the physical risk. And more distant future extreme weather events and risk still happen and propagate over a short time frame, and that's why we think it's also important to monitor such contagion. And yeah, in the interest of time, maybe one thing that is important to mention is what is really clear from our analysis, that more robust data is needed to understand better carbon intensity and also physical risk, and also to see how our work would play out if we look at the financial system as a whole and not only one segment, which is where we also. Thank you for your attention.
A couple of minutes. It's fine to work. So I was just watching this. It's fine. So for network, just to or is this for policy?
No, I think it's a very meaningful issue. So I mean, if you look at this, forget about the this is wrong, but here you see, for instance, how risk has been evolving over time. So this basically the blue line is the transition risk, and the black side is the market average of all securities. So you have the rating of all the securities held by their carbon intensity, and you see that this is somewhat declining. There is something happening, but for physical risk, this pattern is not yet so clear. That's basically also the message from our analysis that physical risk is maybe the bigger problem still, and we have seen it also in some cases. So when you have in Katrina, something big happening, this has an impact, and we've seen it also in the other presentations. There is something happening Yeah, but this is just from a classification perspective, and again, this goes back to all of these laws of the data.
Well, maybe that's predictable as well. I mean, you know it's gonna happen in higher frequency, but not necessarily where first position is policy. You can also think that it's easy to reach.
So what do you mean by saying the transition risk is absurd? So the sense that the markets are really anticipating some transitions. So actually, if you get turn the system with that transition risk, you don't see actually a conclusion.
Yeah, what you see, I mean, if you maybe look at this chart, so. Here is speaking about. So what I want to say with this is that there is still a few firms that have a positive gain in a shock scenario. And that is important if you look at the overall market, if you look at the market as a whole, when a shock hits and there's gainers and losers, then the others in the system have some buffer because not everybody holds the brown ones as fund shares and but also some of the green. And if you have this grenade in terms of impact, that is like risk mitigation. That's at least how we see it. While if you have this result here, everybody has an impact across the board, then there's nothing is mitigated, and you have then like almost a crisis situation, which is something what we want to avoid. We don't want to have only losers, we want to have at least some gains somewhere, and that helps you because if there's somebody gaining, it's positive for the system.
If there are investors, you cannot diversify your cash flow short term by the other things.
Exactly. Yeah. But that's a bit the message.
Thank you.